Jamal Carter believed hard work would protect him. At just 20, he tied a white apron in a Chicago corporate cafeteria, chasing a dream of becoming a chef while enduring quiet contempt from those who saw him as invisible. When food was secretly swapped, sickness spread and money disappeared, the system needed a scapegoat. His signature became the weapon. His silence became the proof. In a courtroom where power spoke louder than truth, Jamal stood alone, already judged before the verdict was spoken. They thought he would break. They were wrong. Before we begin, tell us in the comments, where are you watching from today? And if you believe some heroes are willing to look guilty to save the innocent, this story is for you. Late autumn had settled over Chicago like a held breath. Cold wind swept between steel towers and glass offices, rattling dry leaves along the sidewalks around Northbridge Dynamics, a corporate giant whose mirrored walls reflected a city that never quite slowed down, even when the weather demanded it. The sky was pale and heavy, the kind that promised snow but delivered only cold. Down below, in the basement level of the building, warmth came not from sunlight but from fluorescent lights and industrial ovens. For Jamal Carter, that basement cafeteria was more than a workplace. It was a beginning. Jamal was 20 years old, tall and slim with deep brown skin and narrow shoulders that still carried the softness of youth, rather than the weight of experience. His hands were long-fingered and quick, always moving as if they were already used to a rhythm others couldn't hear yet. His eyes, dark, alert, and quietly observant, looked at the world the way a cook looks at ingredients, assessing, imagining, improving. He wore his hair short and neat, not out of fashion but habit. Order calmed him. That morning, he stood in front of a narrow locker, tying a plain white apron around his waist. The fabric was stiff, newly laundered, still smelling faintly of detergent. To anyone else, it was just a uniform. To Jamal, it felt like a vow, one step closer to the life he wanted. He hadn't grown up dreaming of corner offices or corporate titles. He dreamed of kitchens, of heat, timing, balance, of taking something simple and making it matter. The job at Northbridge's cafeteria wasn't glamorous. Officially, his title was kitchen assistant. Unofficially, it meant everything no one else wanted to do. Jamal washed trays until his fingers wrinkled. He sorted vegetables for hours, separating what could be used from what couldn't. He mopped floors slick with grease long after the lunch rush ended. When asked to stay late, he stayed. When told to redo something already finished, he did it again without complaint. He believed, perhaps stubbornly, that effort would speak for itself. But from the very first day, he felt it. The invisible wall. It wasn't shouted insults or open hostility, it was quieter than that. Conversations that flowed easily until he stepped closer, then stopped. Jokes exchanged freely, followed by awkward silence when Jamal entered the room. Smiles that were polite but never warm. He was acknowledged but never included. Some of the white employees were civil. A nod here, a short morning there, but their eyes slid past him, as if looking too directly might invite discomfort. Jamal noticed everything. He always had. He told himself it didn't matter. He was here to learn. The cafeteria's supply operations were overseen by Tyler Briggs, a man in his early 30s with a stocky build and a soft belly that pushed slightly against his button-down shirts. Tyler's hair was light brown and always carefully styled, his beard trimmed just enough to look intentional. His voice carried easily, sharp, confident, accustomed to being obeyed. He spoke like someone who had never seriously been told no. Everyone knew Tyler's last name mattered more than his job title. He was the nephew of Gregory Hale, Northbridge's Vice President of Operations. That fact hovered around him like an invisible badge. In the cafeteria, power didn't belong to the head chef or the managers. It belonged to Tyler. When Tyler first noticed Jamal, he didn't bother hiding his assessment. His eyes moved over Jamal the way someone might inspect a new piece of equipment, checking usefulness, not humanity. "You want to learn the trade?" Tyler asked one afternoon, leaning against a stainless steel counter, arms crossed. Jamal nodded. "Yes, sir?" Tyler smirked. "Then do what you're told. Don't screw up. Simple." To Tyler, Jamal wasn't a young man with ambition. He was labor, replaceable labor. Jamal swallowed whatever he felt and kept working. During breaks, when Jamal finally sat down with a tray of food, he usually chose the quietest table he could find. He ate quickly, not because he wasn't hungry, but because being watched made him uncomfortable. He felt eyes on him even when no one was looking directly. Across the cafeteria, often seated alone near the windows, was Emily Parker. Emily was 22, white, with a slim frame and an unassuming presence that allowed her to move through spaces without drawing much attention. Her brown hair was usually tied back in a low ponytail, practical rather than stylish. She dressed simply, cardigans, flat shoes, neutral colors, blending into the background of corporate life. As a junior data analyst, she spent most of her day staring at numbers on a screen, patterns hidden beneath columns no one else had time to study. Emily had a quiet temperament. She wasn't shy, but she wasn't loud either. She listened more than she spoke, and when she did speak, her words were deliberate. Years earlier, during college, she'd watched her father lose his job after refusing to sign off on falsified reports. That experience had carved something permanent into her character, a low tolerance for arrogance, and a deep discomfort with power that went unquestioned. She noticed Jamal almost immediately, not because of pity, because of contrast. She saw how he worked, methodical, focused, respectful. She saw how others responded to him with indifference at best, irritation at worst. She noticed Tyler's tone when he spoke to Jamal versus how he spoke to everyone else. Emily had learned long ago that patterns repeat, even when people pretend they don't. Sometimes, when Jamal passed her table, their eyes met briefly. He always nodded politely. She returned the gesture. It wasn't much, but it was something. On Jamal's third week, he stayed late to help reorganize the dry storage room. The overhead lights buzzed softly as boxes were shifted and shelves relabeled. Jamal moved carefully, reading each label, stacking items neatly. Tyler watched from the doorway, arms crossed, chewing gum. "Don't overthink it," Tyler said. "Just put the boxes where they fit." Jamal paused. "The dates are different. If we rotate them wrong?" Tyler cut him off. "You here to follow instructions or write a cookbook?" Jamal nodded and did as he was told. That night, walking back to his small apartment on the south side, Jamal replayed the exchange in his head. He wondered if he should have spoken up more. He wondered if staying quiet made him invisible or safe. The wind cut through his jacket and he pulled it tighter around himself. He reminded himself why he was here. Back in the cafeteria the next morning, the routine continued. Prep. Clean. Serve. Smile when required. Stay silent when necessary. At the far end of the room, Emily watched Tyler slap a clipboard down on a table and bark orders. She watched Jamal take the clipboard without argument. She didn't know yet why it bothered her so much, but it did. None of them knew it then, but the apron Jamal tied each morning was already pulling him into something far bigger than a kitchen. And in a building full of glass walls and closed doors, the first cracks were quietly forming. Northbridge Dynamics prided itself on generosity. On paper, the company's cafeteria budget was described as unlimited. The highest grade ingredients, no portion limits, no shortcuts. Food, the executives liked to say, was an investment in productivity. The document looked clean, ethical, even admirable. But policies, Jamal was learning, did not cook meals. People did. And people could bend almost anything. It started on a Monday morning, quiet and unremarkable, the kind of day that rarely announced its importance. Jamal was finishing prep when Tyler Briggs called him over with a crooked finger. Tyler stood beside a metal desk near the loading bay holding a clipboard. He looked relaxed, almost bored, chewing gum slowly. His shirt was neatly pressed. His sleeves rolled just enough to look hands-on without actually being so. "From now on," Tyler said, tapping the clipboard against his palm, "you're going to help me with intake." Jamal blinked. "Intake, sir?" "Quality checks, signing deliveries." Tyler's mouth curved into a thin smile. "Promotion, you could say." Jamal hesitated. He was still new. Too new. "I thought that was my job?" Tyler cut in smoothly. "It is, but I'm busy, and you seem careful." Careful. The word landed oddly. Jamal nodded anyway. He didn't want to look ungrateful. He didn't want to look suspicious. Tyler handed him the clipboard. "Just follow the checklist. If it looks right, sign. I trust you." That was the first time Tyler had ever said something that sounded like trust. The deliveries arrived early each morning. Jamal learned quickly. He checked the temperature on meat crates, inspected seals on seafood containers, read labels twice to confirm dates and suppliers. He smelled produce, pressed gently for firmness, rejected anything that felt wrong. He took the work seriously, more seriously than anyone expected. He even recorded short videos on his phone as he worked, narrating quietly to himself. It wasn't for proof. It was habit. Jamal learned by repetition, by review. One day, he told himself, these details would matter in a real kitchen. For the first few days, everything seemed normal. Then the complaints began. A software engineer wrinkled his nose at lunch. A project manager pushed her tray away untouched. Someone joked loudly about mystery meat, and laughter rippled through the room before dying quickly. Jamal overheard words like off, sour, rubbery. He noticed people eating less, leaving more behind. No one complained officially. No one filed reports. They just stopped trusting the food. Jamal felt his stomach tighten. He replayed his mornings in his head. He hadn't missed anything. He was sure of it. After his shift one evening, he waited until the cafeteria emptied and walked back into the storage area. The lights hummed softly. He moved quietly, careful not to draw attention. What he saw made his chest ache. The crates he had inspected that morning, clearly labeled premium grade, were gone. In their place sat nearly identical containers, same shape, same color, but the labels were slightly different. Smaller font, different supplier code. The produce inside looked duller. The meat packaging felt warmer. Jamal stood there for a long moment, hands clenched at his sides. The next day, he approached Tyler carefully. Tyler was leaning against the counter with the coffee, laughing with another supervisor. "Hey," Jamal said softly when the others drifted away. "I think there might be an issue with the stock rotation." Tyler raised an eyebrow. "An issue?" "The crates I checked yesterday, some of them aren't the same ones in storage now." Tyler's smile vanished. He set his coffee down hard enough for it to slosh over the rim. "You accusing me of something?" Tyler asked, voice low. Jamal shook his head quickly. "No, sir. Maybe there was a mix-up." Tyler leaned in close. Jamal could smell the coffee on his breath. "Listen carefully," Tyler said. "You signed the paperwork. That means you verified the goods. That means you're responsible." Jamal swallowed. "I understand." "Good," Tyler said, straightening. "Then don't go imagining problems where there aren't any." Jamal walked away feeling smaller than he had all year. Above the cafeteria, in a quiet office lined with monitors, Emily Parker stared at her screen. She had been assigned to assist with a routine expense review. Nothing urgent, nothing exciting. But the numbers didn't sit right with her. Food costs were steady. Too steady. Complaints, according to internal feedback surveys, were rising. Yet vendor expenses showed no fluctuation. No spikes, no adjustments. Everything balanced perfectly. Emily leaned back in her chair. She was slim, with slightly hunched shoulders from years of leaning over desks, and her fingers tapped lightly against the armrest as she thought. Perfection in data often meant manipulation. Her father had taught her that without meaning to. She pulled up vendor histories and scrolled slowly. One name appeared intermittently: Lakeshore Wholesale. It wasn't a primary supplier. It shouldn't have been there at all. Each entry was small, tucked neatly under inventory adjustments. Emily frowned. Downstairs, Jamal tried to push forward. He continued checking deliveries, continued signing forms, continued recording videos. But the atmosphere shifted. Tyler watched him more closely now. Conversation stopped when Jamal entered the room, not out of indifference, but tension. One afternoon, Sarah Whitman sat across from Jamal during break. Sarah was in her late 40s, tall and thin, with tired eyes and streaks of gray woven through her blonde hair. She had worked at Northbridge for over 15 years, long enough to know when to keep quiet. Years earlier, she had spoken up about unfair scheduling and lost her promotion. Since then, she survived by staying invisible. She lowered her voice. "Be careful," she said. Jamal looked up. "About what?" Sarah glanced around before answering. "Signing things you don't control." Jamal nodded slowly. He appreciated the warning, even if it came too late. That night, Emily stayed late at her desk. She cross-referenced timestamps, invoice numbers, approval chains. Patterns emerged, subtle, deliberate. Someone knew exactly how to keep everything just clean enough. She saved copies of her findings to a personal drive, unsure why she felt the need, only knowing that she did. Down in the basement, Jamal locked up and headed for the exit. He paused by the storage door one last time, staring at the shelves. He thought about the signatures he'd written. His name, his handwriting. How easily it could be turned against him. Outside, the Chicago wind cut sharp and unforgiving. Jamal pulled his jacket tighter and walked home, unaware that every signature he had written was already becoming something else. Not proof of diligence, but a trap. Thursday arrived with a strange kind of energy, the kind that filled rooms before anyone understood why. By noon, the cafeteria at Northbridge Dynamics was packed wall to wall, voices overlapping, trays clattering, steam rising from metal counters. Jamal stood at the prep station slicing vegetables with steady hands, the blade tapping a familiar rhythm against the board. He kept his head down, but his awareness stretched across the room the way it always did when something felt off. That was when he noticed the man in the gray jacket. The man stood in line like everyone else, hands tucked into the pockets of a simple coat, a baseball cap pulled low. He was middle-aged, maybe late 50s, with a lean frame and a posture that suggested discipline rather than age. His face was calm, unreadable, but his eyes moved constantly, slow, deliberate, measuring. He didn't check his phone, he didn't chat. He watched. Jamal felt an unexpected tightness in his chest, not fear, recognition. The way you feel when someone is paying attention in a way that matters. The man took a tray and moved along the line, pausing briefly at each station. He chose carefully. Chicken and cream sauce, a mixed salad, and seafood soup. Balanced, deliberate. Jamal's knife slowed as he watched the tray slide past. He wasn't worried about taste. He was worried about everything beneath it. The man sat alone near the center of the room, back straight, fork moving methodically. Jamal returned to his work, forcing himself to breathe normally. The room hummed with noise and appetite, unaware of the invisible thread tightening through it. 15 minutes later, the scream cut through everything. It started with one voice, sharp and panicked, followed by the sound of a tray hitting the floor. A man clutched his stomach and folded forward, face drained of color. Another stood abruptly, knocking his chair back, hand over his mouth. Then a third. The noise swelled into chaos. Chairs scraping, voices shouting, someone yelling for help. Jamal dropped the knife and ran. He knelt beside the first man, guiding him gently to the floor, telling him to stay still. He called 911 with shaking fingers, his voice steady despite the pounding in his ears. "Food poisoning, multiple people," he said, clear and calm. "Yes, corporate building, yes now." Across the room, Emily Parker was already moving. She had abandoned her lunch tray and was kneeling beside a woman who looked seconds away from fainting. Emily's face was pale but focused, her hands steady as she spoke, one hand dialing the internal medical response line, the other holding a water bottle. She didn't think. She acted. The man in the gray jacket stood slowly. He didn't rush to help, not because he didn't care, but because he needed to see everything. He watched Jamal move from person to person, issuing instructions, loosening tight collars, keeping people conscious. He saw Emily coordinating assistance with quiet authority. He saw Tyler Briggs hovering near the back, arms crossed, expression carefully neutral. When paramedics arrived, the cafeteria was a mess of overturned chairs and fear. Sirens echoed faintly from the street above. Employees were escorted out in small groups, some pale and trembling, others furious. Jamal's hands were sticky with spilled soup. his apron stained. He stood aside only when a medic told him to. The man in the gray jacket approached him. "You handled that well," the man said quietly. Jamal nodded, too exhausted to respond properly. "I just did what I could." The man studied him for a moment longer, then turned and walked away without another word. No one noticed when he left. No one asked his name. But within an hour, the building knew exactly who he was. Richard Langston, chairman and CEO of Northbridge Dynamics, had eaten lunch in his own cafeteria. The news traveled fast, skipping formal channels entirely. Managers whispered. Executives retreated behind closed doors. Emails went out marked urgent. By mid-afternoon, a temporary task force was announced. Compliance and food safety review, effective immediately. And on every intake record from the past month, Jamal Carter's signature appeared. Jamal was called into a conference room just before his shift ended. The room was cold, glass walls offering no privacy. Linda Morales, head of internal compliance, sat at the table. She was a woman in her early 40s, average height, dark hair cut sharply at her shoulders. Her posture was rigid, professional to the point of severity. She had built her career on process, not empathy. "We need to understand your role," Linda said, sliding a folder across the table. "You were responsible for verifying incoming food shipments, is that correct?" "Yes," Jamal said. "And you signed off on these deliveries?" "Yes." Linda nodded, pen scratching notes. Her eyes didn't lift. "Then we'll need a full account of your procedures." Jamal spoke carefully, explaining his checks, his recordings, his concerns. He mentioned the crates disappearing. He mentioned the differences in labeling. Linda listened without interruption, but her expression never changed. Outside the room, Tyler waited. When Jamal finally emerged, Tyler stepped forward and clapped him on the shoulder with mock sympathy. "Rough day," he said. "Don't worry, everyone makes mistakes." Jamal met his eyes and saw it clearly now. The anticipation. Tyler wasn't afraid. He was prepared. Upstairs, Emily sat at her desk long after the office emptied. Her hands trembled slightly as she replayed the scene in the cafeteria in her mind. She had seen Tyler's face during the chaos. Not panic. Calculation. She opened her files and pulled up the vendor records again. Lakeshore Wholesale. Adjustment entries. Approval chains leading nowhere. She cross-checked them against security access logs. Who had clearance to storage rooms? Who worked late? A pattern sharpened into focus. Emily copied everything. She didn't know yet what she would do with it. She only knew that something had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Back downstairs, Jamal stood alone in the locker room, scrubbing his hands raw at the sink. The water ran hot and cold, but the feeling wouldn't leave. His name was everywhere now. On forms, in meetings, in conversations he wasn't part of. Outside, Chicago's afternoon sky darkened, clouds pressing low against the buildings. Jamal stepped out into the cold, his breath fogging in front of him. He felt watched, not by eyes, but by a system that had already decided where blame should land. And somewhere high above, Richard Langston sat in his office, reviewing preliminary reports, his expression hard. He had come down to see if the rumors were exaggerated. They were not. The investigation moved faster than Jamal expected, as if it had already been rehearsed. By Friday morning, he was called back into Northbridge not to work, but to surrender his badge. The security desk no longer greeted him with polite indifference. Now the guard avoided his eyes as he slid Jamal a thin envelope and asked for his access card. The plastic felt lighter than it should have, like something that had already lost its meaning. Inside a small conference room with frosted glass walls, Jamal sat alone under bright lights while members of the Compliance and Food Safety Review team rotated in and out. They introduced themselves quickly, names blurring together, their expressions professionally neutral. Someone placed a company-issued phone on the table and asked him to turn his pockets inside out. Another person slid a form across the table, requesting his signature to acknowledge temporary suspension pending review. Temporary. The word sounded generous. It didn't feel that way. The questions came in loops, always calm, always framed as clarification. Are you certain you inspected every crate personally? Was anyone else present when you signed the intake forms? Can you explain why inferior products entered circulation if your checks were thorough? Each question landed softly but carried weight. Jamal answered carefully, repeating the same truth until his throat felt raw. He described his process. He described the missing crates. He described what he had seen in the storage room. When he said, "The goods were switched after I signed," the room shifted. One woman paused her typing. A man leaned back in his chair and folded his arms. The air cooled, not physically, but in tone. Linda Morales returned with a thick folder. She opened it deliberately and slid several documents forward. Jamal recognized his handwriting immediately. His signature, repeated neatly at the bottom of the page after page. "These are your approvals," Linda said. "They establish responsibility." 2 warehouse workers were brought in next. Mark Ellison, broad-shouldered with rough hands and a permanently stooped posture, spoke first. He avoided Jamal's eyes as he said Jamal had seemed rushed, distracted. The other, Pete Rourke, younger and thinner, nodded along, adding that Jamal hadn't checked everything that closely. Jamal understood without being told. They weren't lying because they hated him. They were lying because fear was easier than truth. By late afternoon, Jamal was formally suspended. His phone was taken, his locker was sealed. He was escorted out as if he might steal something on the way. That night, Jamal returned to his apartment, a narrow 1-bedroom with a kitchen barely big enough to turn around in. He stood in the doorway for a long time before stepping inside. The silence pressed in on him. He washed his hands out of habit, scrubbing until his knuckles reddened, then sat at the small table with nothing in front of him. He stared at his hands. These hands knew how to slice onions thin enough to melt in a pan. They knew heat, timing, patience. Now, they were evidence. He called his mother in Detroit. Ruth Carter was in her late 50s, short and sturdy, with a voice that carried years of working double shifts and holding families together when systems failed them. She listened without interrupting, her breathing steady on the other end of the line. When Jamal finished, there was a pause. "Don't let them take your heart," she said quietly. "They can take a job. They can take time. They don't get that." Jamal closed his eyes and nodded, even though she couldn't see him. While Jamal sat alone, Emily Parker sat in a different kind of silence, surrounded by screens. The office floor was nearly empty, lights dimmed automatically to night mode. Emily's reflection stared back at her from the glass, pale and tired, but determined. She had replayed the scene from the cafeteria over and over in her head. She had replayed Tyler's face during the chaos, the lack of urgency, the faint irritation as if the event inconvenienced him. Emily did not like Tyler Briggs. She never had. Months earlier, she had watched him humiliate a server in front of others for misplacing a tray. The server, a young immigrant woman, had apologized repeatedly while Tyler continued, voice raised, enjoying the attention. No one had intervened. Emily hadn't either. The memory still burned. This time, she decided, would be different. She opened archived logs and cross-referenced shipment schedules with badge access times. Tyler's badge appeared frequently after hours near storage zones. That alone proved nothing. But when Emily overlaid vendor adjustments, patterns sharpened. Lakeshore Wholesale appeared again and again, always small amounts, always just under thresholds that triggered automatic review. Emily saved screenshots. She exported spreadsheets. She wrote dates and times in a notebook she kept hidden at the bottom of her bag. She did not confront Tyler. She did not report anything yet. She watched. She listened. She waited. At Northbridge, the narrative hardened quickly. Emails circulated reminding employees of food safety protocols and urging cooperation with the investigation. Jamal's name appeared only once, buried in formal language. But in break rooms and elevators, whispers filled the gaps. The story simplified itself. Someone had failed. Someone had to answer for it. Tyler moved through the building with ease. He spoke louder than usual, laughed more often. When asked about the investigation, he shrugged. "Unfortunate situation," he said. "We trusted the wrong person." Emily heard that line from 3 different mouths by the end of the week. On Sunday evening, Jamal returned to Northbridge one last time, escorted by security, to collect personal items from his locker. Sarah Whitman was there, pretending to sort supplies nearby. She caught Jamal's eye and gave a small, sad smile. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. Jamal nodded. He didn't trust his voice. As he left, rain began to fall outside, thin and cold, streaking the glass walls of the building. Chicago blurred into reflections and shadows. Jamal stepped into it without an umbrella, letting the water soak into his jacket. He felt exposed, marked. Above him, in offices he could no longer enter, decisions were being shaped without him. And beneath those decisions lay signatures that told only part of the story. The poisoning case exploded beyond the walls of Northbridge. Local news vans lined the streets outside the Cook County Courthouse, their antennas raised like warning signals. Headlines spoke of negligence, corruption, and danger in a place meant to nourish workers. The employee union demanded accountability. Executives demanded containment. And so the company did what powerful institutions often do when truth becomes inconvenient. They brought the matter into a courtroom and called it transparency. Jamal Carter stood before the bench on the first morning of hearings, hands clasped tightly in front of him. His shirt was old but freshly pressed, the collar a little too soft from years of washing. Dark circles shadowed his eyes and his posture, once straight and confident in the kitchen, now carried the weight of sleepless nights. He looked younger than his 20 years, and to many in the room, that youth read not as innocence, but as weakness. People stared openly, some with curiosity, some with quiet contempt. Jamal felt their gazes the way one feels cold through thin fabric. At the prosecution table sat Assistant District Attorney Paul Renwick, a lean man in his 40s with a sharp nose and an expression that rarely softened. His hair was graying at the temples, neatly combed, his tie always perfectly centered. Renwick spoke with the assurance of someone who believed strongly in systems and rarely questioned who those systems protected. From the start, his approach was singular. "You signed the intake forms," Renwick repeated, holding up copies of Jamal's paperwork as if they were photographs of a crime. "You verified quality. People were poisoned. Responsibility follows the signature." Jamal's public defender, Marianne Lopez, sat beside him. She was in her early 30s, petite, with tired eyes and a stack of case files that spoke of overwork rather than preparation. She believed Jamal, but belief did not always translate into power. She objected when she could, but the rhythm of the courtroom favored the accusation. Northbridge's legal counsel sat 2 rows away, noticeably distant. They had provided documents, not defense. Jamal understood the message clearly. He was no longer one of theirs. Presiding over the case was Judge Howard Klein. He was in his late 60s, tall, broad-shouldered even in age, with silver hair combed straight back and a face etched by decades of authority. His voice was deep and forceful, accustomed to commanding silence. Years on the bench had shaped his worldview. Efficiency over nuance, precedent over possibility. From the first session, his impatience was obvious. "You're asking this court to believe," Judge Klein said sharply, leaning forward, "that an entire supply system was compromised. And yet the man signing off on it noticed nothing until after the fact?" Jamal swallowed. "I noticed, Your Honor. I reported—" Klein cut him off with a strike of the gavel. "Answer the question." "Yes," Jamal said quietly. A ripple of murmurs passed through the gallery. Behind Jamal, Tyler Briggs sat relaxed, one ankle resting on his knee. He wore a tailored suit today, his posture open, confident. He met Jamal's eyes briefly and smiled, not warmly, but with satisfaction. Tyler looked like a man watching a plan unfold exactly as intended. Beside Tyler sat Gregory Hale, Vice President of Operations. Hale was in his early 60s, tall and well-fed, his hair thinning but carefully styled. His expression was one of polite annoyance, as though this entire affair were a minor inconvenience interrupting a much more important schedule. When reporters glanced his way, he straightened, embodying respectability. Outside the courthouse, public opinion hardened. Some people held signs demanding justice for the poisoned workers. Others shook their heads and muttered words that cut deeper than accusations. Jamal overheard one passerby say, "You really trust a black kid with food safety?" The sentence lodged itself in his chest like a splinter. Inside, the prosecution built its case piece by piece. Paperwork, timelines, witnesses. The 2 warehouse workers repeated their earlier statements, voices trembling but consistent. Jamal's videos were introduced briefly, then dismissed. "Your Honor," Renwick said smoothly, "these recordings do not prove what happened after the defendant left the storage area. They show intent to appear thorough, not actual control." Each time Jamal tried to explain, Judge Klein's patience thinned. His questions grew sharper, his tone more dismissive. The courtroom felt less like a place seeking truth and more like a machine grinding toward a predetermined outcome. On the 3rd day, exhaustion hung heavy in the air. Jamal's throat burned from answering the same questions. His hands trembled slightly as he gripped the edge of the table. He felt the room closing in, every document another stone added to his weight. Then the clerk interrupted proceedings. "Your Honor," she said, holding up a large manila envelope, "the court has received an anonymous submission." A murmur spread instantly. Judge Klein frowned. "Anonymous?" "Yes, Your Honor. It was delivered this morning and logged per procedure." The envelope was thick. He signaled for it to be brought forward. Tyler's smile faltered. The judge examined the contents silently at first. Printed bank statements, transcripts, a flash drive taped neatly inside. His brows knit together as he flipped pages. He glanced up once, eyes scanning the room, then nodded to the bailiff. "We will recess briefly," Judge Klein said. "This court will review the submission." The gavel struck. As people stood, Jamal remained seated, heart pounding. He had no idea what was in that envelope. But for the first time since stepping into the courtroom, something shifted. Not in his favor yet, but away from certainty. Tyler leaned back in his chair, jaw tight now, fingers drumming once against his knee before stopping. Somewhere in the gallery, Emily Parker sat perfectly still, her face pale but composed. She did not look at Jamal. She did not look at Tyler. She stared straight ahead, breathing slowly, knowing only this, that the story was no longer as simple as the court wanted it to be. The courtroom returned from recess heavier than before, as if the air itself had absorbed the tension. The manila envelope lay open on the judge's bench, its contents neatly arranged. Printed pages, a labeled USB drive, and a handwritten note with no signature. Whispers rippled through the gallery, but no one could quite guess which way the tide was about to turn. Judge Howard Klein sat back in his chair, glasses low on his nose, reading in silence. The longer he read, the deeper the lines in his forehead became. This was not the impatient man from earlier sessions. This was a judge being forced to look again. The clerk inserted the USB into the court system. The screen flickered to life. First came the messages. Clear, time-stamped exchanges between Tyler Briggs and a contact saved as Mason. The words were blunt, careless in the way people become when they believe they are untouchable. They discussed switching premium-grade shipments with lower-grade substitutes after intake. They joked about labels that were perfect copies and crates that would pass a quick glance. One message ended with a laughing emoji and the line, "As long as the kid signs, we're clean." Jamal's chest tightened. He did not recognize Mason, but the tone was unmistakable. Then the audio file played. Tyler's voice filled the courtroom, confident and mocking. He bragged about the system, about how easy it was. He mentioned Gregory Hale by name, spoke of steady transfers, and reassured him not to worry. "Jamal signs everything," Tyler said in the recording. "He doesn't even know what he's covering for." The sound cut off. No one spoke. The final documents appeared next. Bank statements. Monthly deposits into Hale's personal account, always arriving the day after Northbridge released cafeteria funds. The amounts were large enough to matter, small enough to hide. Perfectly timed. Judge Klein removed his glasses. For the first time in days, he did not reach for the gavel. He looked at Jamal. Then he looked at Tyler. Tyler had gone pale. His earlier confidence drained from his posture, replaced by a tight smile that no longer convinced even himself. "Anonymous evidence," he said quickly, his voice slightly higher than before. This could be fabricated. Anyone could. Assistant District Attorney Renwick raised a hand. Your Honor, the prosecution requests immediate authentication. The court technicians moved swiftly. Phone records were checked. Voice analysis was run. Network metadata matched. The timestamps aligned. One by one, the excuses collapsed. The dominoes fell exactly as Jamal had once imagined, but never dared to expect. Tyler was taken into custody before the end of the afternoon, hands cuffed behind his back, his tailored suit suddenly ill-fitting. Gregory Hale was escorted out separately, face flushed, his authority stripped down to a man awaiting indictment. Investigators moved quickly on Lakeshore Wholesale, sealing offices and seizing records. When Judge Klein finally spoke again, his voice was rough, scraped raw by realization. This court acknowledges a failure, he said slowly, not of process but of judgment. He turned to Jamal. Mr. Carter, this court finds you not guilty on all charges. The words landed softly at first, then all at once. Jamal's knees weakened. He gripped the table, breathing hard, as if learning how to breathe again. Tears blurred his vision, but he did not wipe them away. He had spent too long being told to hold himself together. Judge Klein cleared his throat. I allowed assumption to outrun evidence, he continued. That is not justice. I regret it. The gavel came down, not in condemnation but closure. Outside the courthouse, Chicago sunlight broke through the clouds that had hung over the city for days. Jamal stepped onto the stone steps, squinting as warmth touched his face. It felt unfamiliar, like something he had forgotten existed. A few feet away stood Emily Parker. She looked smaller out here, away from screens and desks, her shoulders slightly hunched, her hands folded in front of her. Her brown hair had come loose from its tie, strands lifting in the breeze. She did not smile broadly or step forward for recognition. She simply waited. I couldn't watch them crush you, she said quietly when Jamal reached her. So I didn't. Jamal studied her for a moment, then nodded. His eyes were red, his smile unsteady but real. Thank you, he said. One day I'll cook for you. Properly. Emily smiled then. Soft, relieved. I'll hold you to that. Northbridge moved fast in the weeks that followed. Public apologies were issued. Policies were rewritten. To repair both damage and reputation, the company established a culinary apprenticeship program and funded scholarships for employees from marginalized backgrounds. It wasn't redemption, but it was something. Chairman Richard Langston requested a private meeting with Jamal. Langston looked older than he had in the cafeteria, the weight of responsibility evident in his posture. He listened more than he spoke. When Jamal finished recounting his experience, Langston opened a small box and slid it across the table. Inside was a new apron. White. Clean. Jamal's name was embroidered neatly across the chest. Jamal Carter, culinary apprentice. You deserved better, Langston said. This is a start. Jamal accepted it with both hands. A year later, on a quiet street near River North, Jamal stood behind the open kitchen of a small restaurant. The air was thick with the scent of butter, garlic, and fresh herbs. He moved with calm precision, confidence finally settling into his bones. The pain hadn't vanished, but it no longer defined him. At a table by the window, Emily sat watching, a glass of water in front of her. When the dish arrived, lemon-seared chicken, balanced and clean, she smiled before taking the first bite. It was perfect. Those who once laughed had lost their footing, their titles, their certainty. But Jamal didn't measure victory by their fall. Happy endings, he had learned, weren't about the world becoming kind. They were about truth surviving long enough for someone to stand with it. The courtroom returned from recess heavier than before, as if the air itself had absorbed the tension. The manila envelope lay open on the judge's bench, its contents neatly arranged. Printed pages, a labeled USB drive, and a handwritten note with no signature. Whispers rippled through the gallery, but no one could quite guess which way the tide was about to turn. Judge Howard Klein sat back in his chair, glasses low on his nose, reading in silence. The longer he read, the deeper the lines in his forehead became. This was not the impatient man from earlier sessions. This was a judge being forced to look again. The clerk inserted the USB into the court system. The screen flickered to life. First came the messages. Clear, time-stamped exchanges between Tyler Briggs and a contact saved as Mason. The words were blunt, careless in the way people become when they believe they are untouchable. They discussed switching premium-grade shipments with lower-grade substitutes after intake. They joked about labels that were perfect copies and crates that would pass a quick glance. One message ended with a laughing emoji and the line, "As long as the kids' signs were clean." Jamal's chest tightened. He did not recognize Mason, but the tone was unmistakable. Then the audio file played. Tyler's voice filled the courtroom, confident and mocking. He bragged about the system, about how easy it was. He mentioned Gregory Hale by name, spoke of steady transfers, and reassured him not to worry. "Jamal signs everything," Tyler said in the recording. "He doesn't even know what he's covering for." The sound cut off. No one spoke. The final documents appeared next. Bank statements. Monthly deposits into Hale's personal account, always arriving the day after Northbridge released cafeteria funds. The amounts were large enough to matter, small enough to hide, perfectly timed. Judge Klein removed his glasses. For the first time in days, he did not reach for the gavel. He looked at Jamal. Then he looked at Tyler. Tyler had gone pale. His earlier confidence drained from his posture, replaced by a tight smile that no longer convinced even himself. "Anonymous evidence," he said quickly, his voice slightly higher than before. "This could be fabricated. Anyone could." Assistant District Attorney Renwick raised a hand. "Your Honor, the prosecution requests immediate authentication." The court technicians moved swiftly. Phone records were checked. Voice analysis was run. Network metadata matched. The timestamps aligned. One by one, the excuses collapsed. The dominoes fell exactly as Jamal had once imagined, but never dared to expect. Tyler was taken into custody before the end of the afternoon, hands cuffed behind his back, his tailored suit suddenly ill-fitting. Gregory Hale was escorted out separately, face flushed, his authority stripped down to a man awaiting indictment. Investigators moved quickly on Lakeshore Wholesale, sealing offices and seizing records. When Judge Klein finally spoke again, his voice was rough, scraped raw by realization. "This court acknowledges a failure," he said slowly. "Not of process, but of judgment." He turned to Jamal. "Mr. Carter, this court finds you not guilty on all charges." The words landed softly at first, then all at once. Jamal's knees weakened. He gripped the table, breathing hard as if learning how to breathe again. Tears blurred his vision, but he did not wipe them away. He had spent too long being told to hold himself together. Judge Klein cleared his throat. "I allowed assumption to outrun evidence," he continued. "That is not justice. I regret it." The gavel came down, not in condemnation, but closure. Outside the courthouse, Chicago sunlight broke through the clouds that had hung over the city for days. Jamal stepped onto the stone steps, squinting as warmth touched his face. It felt unfamiliar, like something he had forgotten existed. A few feet away stood Emily Parker. She looked smaller out here, away from screens and desks. Her shoulders slightly hunched, her hands folded in front of her. Her brown hair had come loose from its tie, strands lifting in the breeze. She did not smile broadly or step forward for recognition. She simply waited. "I couldn't watch them crush you," she said quietly when Jamal reached her. "So I didn't." Jamal studied her for a moment, then nodded. His eyes were red, his smile unsteady but real. "Thank you," he said. "One day I'll cook for you, properly." Emily smiled then. Soft, relieved. "I'll hold you to that." Northbridge moved fast in the weeks that followed. Public apologies were issued. Policies were rewritten. To repair both damage and reputation, the company established a culinary apprenticeship program and funded scholarships for employees from marginalized backgrounds. It wasn't redemption, but it was something. Chairman Richard Langston requested a private meeting with Jamal. Langston looked older than he had in the cafeteria, the weight of responsibility evident in his posture. He listened more than he spoke. When Jamal finished recounting his experience, Langston opened a small box and slid it across the table. Inside was a new apron, white, clean. Jamal's name was embroidered neatly across the chest. Jamal Carter, culinary apprentice. "You deserved better," Langston said. "This is a start." Jamal accepted it with both hands. A year later, on a quiet street near River North, Jamal stood behind the open kitchen of a small restaurant. The air was thick with the scent of butter, garlic, and fresh herbs. He moved with calm precision, confidence finally settling into his bones. The pain hadn't vanished, but it no longer defined him. At a table by the window, Emily sat watching, a glass of water in front of her. When the dish arrived, lemon-seared chicken, balanced and clean, she smiled before taking the first bite. It was perfect. Those who once laughed had lost their footing, their titles, their certainty. But Jamal didn't measure victory by their fall. Happy endings, he had learned, weren't about the world becoming kind. They were about truth surviving long enough for someone to stand with it.